On September 13th, 1993, a century-long conflict attained newfound hope when the historical handshake between the leaders of Israel and Palestine took place on the White House lawn. The interaction began a hunt for peace between the two nations after they signed the first document of the Oslo peace process, Oslo I. This document was the result of an unresolved border conflict between Israel and Palestine, dating back to the beginning of the 20th century, when thousands of European Jews migrated to the Middle East to take part in the Zionist movement. The belief that Judaism is not just a religion, but instead an ethnic identity, and that Jews deserve a nation of their own. The British government backed this movement after publicizing the Balfour Declaration, a statement that provided their support for a national home for the Jewish people. This notion grew considerably after World War II and the horrific acts done to Jewish people during the Holocaust. So in 1947, the United Nations created a plan with the British government, who controlled the Israel-Palestine region, to divide the region into Jewish-governed Israel and Arab-governed Palestine. Neighboring Arab countries objected to the UN partition plan and the Jewish takeover of British Palestine, which resulted in the devastating Arab-Israeli War in 1948. The 9-month conflict ended with an Israeli victory. Israel took control of the area proposed to them by the UN and 2/3 of the land which was allotted to Palestine. The day the war ended, over 700,000 Palestinians officially became refugees in their former territory. Since then, numerous wars have occurred in the area that have intensified the conflict. Attempts to halt the violence and negotiate peace have failed to resolve the decades-long border dispute. The Oslo Accords had the intention to be unlike its failed predecessors, and its noteworthiness stems from how close the conflict came to resolution because of it. In pursuit of long-standing peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Oslo Accords emerged as the result of negotiations between the two nations and outlined stricter definitions of borders and ownership of regions. A frontier of peace was not crossed in the failure of the Oslo Accords, letting down the optimistic hopes of many and escalating pre-existing tensions among nations. The Oslo Accords failed for 5 main reasons. Israel failed to disengage, the Israeli government lacked unity, accord statements were not fulfilled in time, Camp David meetings failed to resolve most issues, which ultimately led to the return of violence with the Second Intifada. There was reason to hope that the Oslo Accords would be a success. The process started after Israel and the PLO secretly met in Oslo to discuss issues between the two nations. The treaties which followed sought to establish clarity on the issues of borders, governance, and peace. Israel wanted to decrease the violence and hostility between the two countries, and Palestine wanted to become recognized as a proper nation and allowed self-governance. These core agreements are stated in Oslo I. The document proposed that Israel would withdraw its military forces from the Gaza Strip and Jericho area. The propositions by both nations were perceived fairly and looked to execute well. Additionally, the accords were grounded by the success of the 1978 Camp David Accords, in which President Jimmy Carter was able to mediate an agreement in the Middle East between Israel and Egypt. The PLO became increasingly irritated at the growing number of illegal Israeli settlers in the Gaza Strip. Settlers are Israelis who have migrated into Palestinian territories to build off communities and even cities. In 2003, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon proposed the idea of disengagement. This proposal was not signed into action, but was perceived as an agreement by both of the nation's people. The PLO's deputy leader explains the reasoning behind the plan in 2 major points. 1, Palestinians are uninterested in negotiating a 2-state solution, and 2, Palestinians want to eliminate the Jewish state altogether. Ultimately, the withdrawal from Gaza was intended to prevent the need to facilitate peace negotiations. In a letter to President George W. Bush, Sharon announced that the plan had no intentions of advancing peacefully. Disengagement later took place in 2005, a unilateral movement that effectively removed all Israeli military installations. 21 Israeli settlements from the Gaza Strip and 4 from the West Bank, including over 8,000 residents. Although this was achieved, the United Nations still consider the Gaza Strip as being militarily occupied by Israel, controlling Gaza's air, land, and sea. This makes the Palestinians completely dependent on Israel for basic utilities. Most importantly, the disengagement plan froze the peace process, preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state and the discussion of refugees, a physical frontier, and an international status for Jerusalem. Israel's political disputes were not only at the international level. The internal relation between parties and members of their political congress, the Knesset, had disputes on how to proceed with the promises made in the Oslo Accords. The Israeli government at the time was a majority split between the in-power Labour Party and the oppositional Likud Party. Likud, the conservative far-right party of Israel, became non-compliant with many of the requests made by the Labour Party. Disruption to the Land for Peace deal with the PLO, promising Israeli withdrawal of the West Bank for peace along the frontier, was fueled by the Likud Party, as it is a platform belief of theirs that the region is crucial to Israel for its historical and religious significance. The party villainized the in-power Labour Party, disguising movement on the Oslo Accords by framing it to be a sign of Israeli weakness. The Likud leader at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, started a protest alongside thousands of radical demonstrators, where an effigy of the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was mutilated. Likud MKs would repeatedly interrupt Rabin's speeches with catcalls and would open black umbrellas as a sign of appeasement. Similarly, the Likud party performed an extremist political demonstration by inappropriately walking into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the holiest place in the city for Muslims. This was done out of political aggression and was intentionally insensitive as to protest against the Oslo Accords. The incident became what is now known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, because of the violent response to the situation by Arab Israelis. The Likud party kindled aggression and violence, which drew the conflict further from resolution. Powerful figures were too optimistic in the level of cooperation that Israel and Palestine would have in future negotiations. Israel itself was split on the Oslo Accords, with the left wing favoring them and the right wing opposing them. Through a Knesset vote, divisiveness was shown in the 11-4 and 50 against vote for the Accords. Additionally, Hamas, the Palestine Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine objected to the Accords. As a quickly growing power, Hamas influenced many Palestinians to reject the possible peace agreement. The mutual distrust between Israel and Palestine only furthered this ambivalent period. The PLO's 10-point program stated that they wanted to liberate all Palestinian territory, convincing Israel that Palestine was motivated only for growing closer to completing this goal rather than creating peace. In an attempt to make peace between the two leaders, President Bill Clinton invited Prime Minister Ehud Barak of Israel and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat to a secluded retreat at Camp David. The summit was an effort to end the conflict in its entirety, but ended without an agreement. The negotiations were mostly verbal, with no consensus being reached, and nothing being written. Eventually, both Israel and Palestine reached agreements, but with certain objections. An argument can be made that Clinton did not play as strong as a role as Carter during the 1974 summit.
Clinton was much more out of our book. He was careful, thoughtful, tried to get them to understand each other, tried to get them to listen to each other. Did all that stuff mediators do, failed. They needed a different kind of mediator. They needed a mediator who was going to come in with a hatchet and start swinging.
The closed-off approach from Israel and the culmination of these ignored problems led to tension on both sides of the conflict, leading to the violent protest in the form of the Second Intifada. With tensions high both in Israeli-Palestinian politics and in the public, the Second Intifada returned violent physical conflict to the region. The Intifada claimed 4,000 lives, many of which were civilians. After violence broke out, the Oslo Accords began to be viewed in an increasingly negative light, making it even more difficult for the public to support the continuation of the Accords. After years of fighting, the Palestinian and Israeli leaders marked an end to the Intifada, and the Israeli Defense Force forcefully put a stop to the violence. But the damage had been done, and the tension between the two nations was now higher than ever. The Oslo peace process showed flashes toward achieving a long-standing peace in the Middle East. While the Oslo Accords did fail, the conflict has never been as close to resolution since. Even now, a balanced political relationship between the two nations has yet to be formed, and peace negotiations have not resumed. While conflict in Russia and Ukraine intensifies, the importance of peace negotiations could not be more relevant. A frontier was not crossed by the Oslo Accords, but they will be an important piece of the story when Israel and Palestine shake hands once again.